It's a story that starts with an ordinary day, but quickly takes a turn no one could have predicted. A young black man walks into a local store, ready to shop for some essentials, never expecting that his visit would end with a humiliating encounter that would leave him questioning everything. The store, which he's visited countless times, holds a promise of a simple experience: grab what he needs and head home. But today, something changes. The manager behind the counter, someone he's seen before, doesn't greet him with the usual courtesy. Instead, there's an unmistakable tension in the air. The energy feels off, but he brushes it off, thinking it's just another ordinary transaction. But what unfolds next shakes him to his core. The store manager, whose job is supposed to be to help and serve, takes an unexpected step that crosses a line, a step that leaves this young man feeling disrespected, humiliated, and hurt. It's not just the words said, but the way he's treated, like he's invisible, like he doesn't belong. He stands there, stunned and speechless, feeling the weight of the manager's condescending gaze. As he tries to make sense of what just happened, the reality of the situation starts to hit him. How could this happen in a place that is meant to be a neutral space? Why him? And what does this really say about the world he's living in? What happens next, though, is the most surprising part of this story. Instead of letting the humiliation swallow him whole, something inside him clicks. He takes a deep breath, steadies himself, and starts to make a decision that will turn the situation on its head. He's not going to walk away defeated. He's not going to let this manager or anyone else define who he is or how he deserves to be treated. In that moment, he taps into something deeper, something powerful. He knows that how he responds now could make all the difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who's ever felt the sting of unfair treatment. And so, the stage is set for a comeback that no one could have seen coming. What happens next will leave you speechless. The store manager, expecting nothing more than a quiet resolution, is about to witness a transformation that will not only challenge his own assumptions but will send a message that no one will forget. But the real question is, how will this all play out? How far will this young man go to reclaim his dignity and make sure the world sees him not as a target for humiliation, but as someone with power and purpose? The tension builds, and the clock is ticking. What happens next is something you won't want to miss. Stay tuned to find out how this moment of injustice becomes a catalyst for something bigger than anyone could have imagined. The air in the store was thick with tension as the young man stood there, trying to process what had just happened. He'd been in situations before, where things didn't feel quite right, but this was different. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, or a rude comment. It was something deeper, more insidious. The manager had barely made eye contact with him, speaking in a tone that was both dismissive and hostile. There was no reason for it. He hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, he had done everything by the book, just like he always did when he came to the store. But today, the manager had decided that his presence wasn't welcome. As the young man stood there, a few other customers glanced over, their eyes darting quickly before turning away. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to notice. No one stepped in to help. No one spoke up. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel the eyes of the manager on him, a silent judgment that spoke volumes. It was clear the manager was trying to assert some kind of power over him, to remind him that he didn't belong. It was in the way the manager moved, slow, calculated, almost as if he were waiting for the young man to do something. Anything. But what could he do? How could he respond to this? It was a moment that could have easily crushed anyone's spirit, especially when no one around him made a move to intervene. But deep down, the young man felt a fire starting to burn. He had seen it before, people pushing others around, trying to remind them of their place in the world. And every time, he had watched those who were pushed down simply walk away. They would leave quietly, feeling small, beaten. But this time would be different. He wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He knew that whatever he did next would shape everything that followed. He had to make a choice to remain passive and let this moment define him, or to stand up, to confront the manager and take control of the situation. There was no middle ground. The manager was still watching him, his eyes filled with an almost smug sense of superiority. But the young man could feel something shifting inside him. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Before he could even process what was happening, his feet moved. It was like his body had already made the decision for him. He turned slowly and walked toward the counter, his eyes fixed on the manager, not in anger, but with a quiet resolve. His heartbeat quickened, but he didn't look away. He wasn't sure what he was going to say yet, but he knew he couldn't just leave. As he stood in front of the counter, the manager's eyes narrowed slightly, as if surprised by his approach. He didn't say anything right away, just stared, probably waiting for the young man to say something. The words were right there, on the tip of his tongue, but he hesitated. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the eyes of the few customers in the store on him. This wasn't just about him and the manager anymore. This was bigger. It felt like an audience had formed, whether they knew it or not. This wasn't just a confrontation over a simple misunderstanding, it was a moment where he could take control of the narrative, rewrite it, and maybe, just maybe, spark something in those watching. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The manager, who had been so quick to dismiss him earlier, now seemed unsure. But the young man still didn't speak. He let the silence stretch between them, allowing it to build. He could feel the tension in the air. The manager cleared his throat, breaking the quiet, and then finally spoke. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain, as though the young man had done something wrong just by existing in the space. The young man didn't flinch. He looked the manager in the eyes and stood tall, the words slowly coming to him. He had to stay calm, composed, but firm. "There's no problem," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to be heard. "The problem is how you've treated me. You don't get to do that. You don't get to make me feel small just because you think you can." The manager seemed taken aback. His face twitched, a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe confusion flashing across it, but he quickly masked it with an air of indifference. "You're overreacting," he said, dismissing the young man's words with a wave of his hand. "I didn't do anything to you." But the young man wasn't fooled. He knew exactly what had just happened. He wasn't overreacting. This was real. This was happening. And now, he was going to make sure it didn't end like every other time. He was going to make sure this moment counted. "I'm not overreacting," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about me. This is about how you treat people like me. People who come in here, spend their money, and expect respect. You don't get to decide when we're good enough for that. You don't get to decide when we matter." The manager's face hardened at his words, his eyes narrowing, but something else seemed to flicker in them, too. Maybe it was discomfort. Maybe it was realization. But the young man couldn't let himself get distracted. He was in this moment now, and it was going to count. He took a step back, his posture firm, and then spoke again. "You may think you've got all the power here, but let me tell you something. You don't. People like you, who think they can get away with treating others like dirt, need to understand something. You don't control the narrative anymore." The manager opened his mouth, probably to retort, but the young man cut him off, not giving him a chance to escalate things further. The young man's voice was unwavering, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until I'm treated with the respect I deserve. And don't think you can just brush me off. This is bigger than just this store. This is bigger than me." For a moment, it seemed like the manager might speak, but instead, he just stood there, mouth slightly open, looking at the young man in a way he hadn't before. His eyes weren't filled with the same arrogant certainty. For a brief second, the power had shifted. But the young man knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a tension that neither of them could ignore. Around them, the store seemed to hold its breath, the few customers that had remained staring at them with wide eyes. No one spoke. It was like the world outside had fallen away, leaving just the two of them in this charged, unresolved moment. Neither one of them was ready to back down. And that's when the young man knew this wasn't just about getting an apology. It wasn't just about standing up for himself in the moment. This was a turning point. He had stepped into a space where he could challenge not just one person's prejudice or arrogance, but a system that had allowed it to continue unchecked for far too long. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had been treated unfairly. Everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or belittled because of who they were. And now, he had a chance to change that. But the question remained, would he be able to push through the fear, the doubt, and the resistance from those who stood in his way? Would the manager, unwilling to back down, escalate things further? Or would this moment of confrontation be the catalyst for something bigger? The tension in the store was palpable, and all eyes were on him. His next move would determine it all. And whatever happened next would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. Stay tuned. The silence lingered, thick and uncomfortable. The manager's eyes narrowed as he tried to regain his composure, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. The young man stood firm, his posture unyielding, his mind racing. He had already said his piece, but he wasn't ready to let this go just yet. He wasn't about to give the manager an easy way out, not this time. But neither was he going to escalate it into something more dangerous. He needed to think. The tension in the store was like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone. Customers had shifted their positions slightly, clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding, but no one was brave enough to intervene. Some glanced around, unsure whether to get involved, but they quickly turned their attention back to whatever they had been doing before. It was clear that this wasn't a situation anyone wanted to be a part of, but it was happening. And everyone could feel it. The young man knew he couldn't rely on anyone else. This wasn't just about him and the manager anymore, it was about something much bigger. It was about standing up, not just for himself, but for all those who had silently endured similar treatment, those who had been ignored, insulted, or dismissed because of their skin color, their appearance, or their place in society. He felt a fire in his chest, a desire to break through the walls of silence and fear that surrounded him. But at the same time, doubt gnawed at him. Was he really making a difference? Was this just a small, fleeting moment that would be forgotten by the next day? Or was he on the edge of something that could change everything? The manager, still holding his ground behind the counter, let out a sharp breath and finally spoke. "Look," he said, his voice strained, "I don't have time for this. I've got customers to attend to." He made a motion as though to turn away, clearly hoping to brush the young man off. But the young man wasn't having it. He took a step forward, his voice steady but unwavering. "You don't get to just dismiss me," he said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't get to walk away from this. This isn't just some minor inconvenience for you. This is about respect. This is about being treated like a human being." His voice grew a little louder with each word, but he was careful not to shout. This wasn't a battle he needed to win with volume, it was one that had to be won with conviction. The manager hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. The young man could see it, the crack in the armor, the momentary flicker of doubt. But before he could say anything else, the manager spoke again, his tone defensive, his face flushed with frustration. "Respect? You want respect?" The manager laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think I'm the problem here? You think this is about me not respecting you? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. You don't know anything about me or what I've had to deal with in this store. You're not the only one who's had it tough. The words hung in the air, and for a split second, the young man was taken aback. He hadn't expected that response. The manager's words were laced with anger and resentment, but there was something else there, too. A vulnerability? A sense of something deeper? It wasn't just about the young man now, it was about the manager, too. The young man couldn't help but wonder what had led him to this point. What made him feel so threatened, so defensive? What was going on in his life that caused him to lash out in this way? Before he could consider it too deeply, though, the moment passed. The manager straightened up, pushing his emotions aside, and adopted his usual, cold demeanor. You want to make a scene? Fine. But don't expect me to apologize. I'm just doing my job. The young man took a slow breath. He wasn't looking for an apology, he didn't need one. What he needed was recognition. He needed the manager, and everyone else in the store, to understand that people like him weren't invisible, weren't disposable. That no one had the right to decide when they mattered, when they were good enough. But as the seconds ticked by, he realized something. This wasn't just a fight against one man. It was a fight against a system. A culture. A way of thinking that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. The manager's attitude wasn't a one-off, it was part of something larger. Something that many people had to navigate every day. And the young man knew that if he just walked away now, nothing would change. Not really. He took a deep breath and, for the first time, allowed himself to look around the store. The other customers were still pretending to mind their own business, but he could feel their eyes on him. He wondered how many of them had been in his shoes before, how many of them had stood in this exact spot, feeling like they didn't belong. He didn't want to be a hero, he wasn't interested in being a martyr. But if he could stand here and make even one person in that store realize that they were worth more than how they were being treated, then it would be worth it. But in that same moment, a deeper question crept into his mind: what if nothing changed? What if this was just another pointless confrontation that would end with him walking away, feeling a little bit more tired than before, but still stuck in the same cycle? What if no one else saw what was happening? What if, in the end, it was all for nothing? He looked back at the manager. There was still something in the man's eyes, something unresolved, something hidden beneath the surface. The young man couldn't let go of the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this situation than just his own pain. Maybe the manager wasn't the real enemy. Maybe there were deeper forces at play, things neither of them fully understood yet. And then, just as the silence seemed unbearable, a voice from the back of the store cut through the tension. I've had enough of this. The voice was firm, but there was a slight tremor in it. The young man turned, and his eyes widened as an older woman stepped forward from the back of the store, her posture straight, her expression filled with quiet defiance. She was a regular at the store, someone the young man recognized but didn't know well. The manager turned toward her, his face momentarily softening. What do you want? The manager asked, his tone less certain now. I want this to stop, the woman said, her voice steady but full of emotion. I've seen you do this before. I've seen you treat people like dirt, and I'm done watching it. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The young man didn't know this woman, but in that moment, it felt like she was fighting for him. Fighting for all of them. Her words, her stance, it was like a light had been switched on in the dark. The young man felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. The manager wasn't backing down yet. Who do you think you are? He sneered. You don't get to come in here and... But the woman wasn't finished. I'm someone who's had enough, she said firmly. And I'm not the only one. The young man's heart raced. This wasn't just his fight anymore. There were others, 2 people who were tired of being treated as less than. But as the tension escalated, the young man couldn't help but wonder, would they all stand together, or would the weight of fear pull them back into silence? The conflict was far from over. And as the manager's eyes flickered between the young man and the woman, something in his expression shifted, but whether it was fear, guilt, or stubborn pride, no one could tell just yet. The clock was ticking, and the story wasn't over. But one thing was certain: the young man's life had changed forever. The real question was, would everyone else be brave enough to change with him? The air in the store had thickened even further, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on everyone. The tension was palpable, but now there was something new in the atmosphere, a crackling sense of anticipation. The older woman had stepped forward, and her words were like a spark igniting something deep within the store. The young man could feel it, too. People were watching now. Not just observing from a distance, but truly watching, waiting to see what would happen next. His heart pounded as he realized that everything was about to change. It was no longer just about him. This moment had taken on a life of its own. The manager, visibly shaken for the first time, had taken a step back, his face flushed with anger but also something else: uncertainty. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. No one had ever stood up to him in such a direct way. His eyes flickered between the young man and the woman, his jaw clenched tightly. It was clear he wasn't ready to back down, but at the same time, he wasn't sure how to proceed. His usual arrogance had faltered, replaced by something darker, something that seemed to smolder beneath the surface. The young man knew he couldn't let this moment slip away. This was his chance, not just for him, but for everyone who had been silenced for too long. "You've made a mistake," the manager spat, his voice now sharp with venom. "Both of you." His eyes were wild now, like a cornered animal lashing out in fear. "I'm in charge here. I don't need to listen to any of this." The older woman didn't flinch, but the young man could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly. She was standing her ground, but this wasn't just about words anymore. This was about something more dangerous: the manager's sense of power, and the way it had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. The young man could feel his own fists clenching at his sides. Every fiber of his being wanted to take control of this moment, to force it into something meaningful, but he knew he couldn't rush it. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about proving something. It was about standing tall in the face of intimidation and injustice. "Listen," the woman said, her voice surprisingly calm, though the young man could hear the steel in it. "You've hurt enough people. I've seen it. I've heard the stories. You think no one notices, but we do. We see how you treat people. And we're not afraid anymore." The manager's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something: fear, maybe? But then his face hardened again, and he shook his head, as though trying to rid himself of the thought. "You think you can come in here and lecture me? You think I care about what you say?" His voice was rising again, filled with contempt. "You're just a couple of nobodies talking a big game. This is my store. And if you don't like it, you can leave." It was as if a switch had been flipped. The young man could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a rising tide of emotions threatening to spill over. He could hear the manager's words, but they didn't reach him anymore. His eyes locked onto the manager's, and for the first time, he saw it: the fear. Beneath the anger, beneath the defensiveness, the manager was scared. Not just of them, but of the truth. The truth of what this moment really represented. The truth of what was at stake. He took a deep breath, and slowly, deliberately, he spoke again, his voice low but carrying the weight of everything that had come before. "You're not in control here. Not anymore." The words came out more firmly than he had expected. He didn't even recognize the strength in his own voice. But it was there, undeniable. And the way the manager's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by the intensity of his words, told him that the tide was shifting. The woman beside him nodded slightly, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement that they were in this together. And in that moment, the young man realized something crucial. This wasn't just about one person standing up against another, it was about a collective breaking of silence. It was about a shared understanding that no one should have to tolerate disrespect, no matter who they were or where they came from. Behind him, the few remaining customers in the store were no longer looking away. They were watching with wide eyes, some with their mouths slightly open, others frozen in place. The silence hung heavy in the air, but there was an undeniable shift. Some of the people who had once looked uncomfortable now seemed to shift in their stance, inching a little closer, as if willing themselves to step forward but not quite ready to do so. The manager's face twisted in frustration, and for a split second, the young man thought he saw a flash of doubt flicker across his expression. Was this really happening? Was this manager really starting to second-guess himself? But before anything could unfold further, a new voice rang out from the back of the store. A younger man, perhaps in his early 20s, had stepped into view. He had a slight smirk on his face, but there was something about the way he looked at the young man and the woman that suggested he wasn't just here for entertainment. "Don't let him intimidate you," the young man said, his voice surprisingly firm. "He's all bark and no bite. I've been coming here for months, and I've seen the way he treats people. It's not right." He glanced at the manager with a mix of defiance and pity. "You've been running this place like it's your kingdom, but guess what? The real world doesn't work that way. People deserve better." The young man's heart skipped a beat as he realized that this stranger, this other customer, was taking a stand too. This wasn't just a confrontation between him and the manager anymore. It was starting to feel like something larger was at play. The people who had been silently watching were starting to feel empowered. They were beginning to find their voices, inspired by the defiance of the woman and the young man standing in front of the counter. The manager looked around, his eyes darting from person to person, his body language betraying his panic. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. He was cornered not physically, but emotionally. His control, his authority, was slipping away, and he knew it. He tried to regain his composure, trying to salvage what little power he had left, but the cracks were beginning to show. "I won't put up with this," the manager muttered under his breath, his voice shaky but edged with anger. "You all need to leave. Now." But there was no room for his threats anymore. The power had shifted, and no one was moving. The customers who had once stood by quietly, waiting for the storm to pass, now stood their ground. The young man could feel that the energy in the room had changed. They weren't backing down. This was no longer a single battle. This was the start of something much bigger. The manager's eyes darted nervously, his fists clenched at his sides, his face now contorted in a mixture of frustration and disbelief. For a brief moment, he stood there, seemingly paralyzed, before taking a step backward, his eyes widening as if he had just realized the depth of what was happening. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, with everything on the edge of unraveling, the sound of the doorbell chimed as the front door swung open. All eyes turned, but no one knew what to expect. The young man's chest tightened. What now? What would happen next? But before anything could unfold, the door slammed shut behind the newcomer, the air vibrating with an unsettling energy. No one knew who had entered, but one thing was clear: this moment was far from over. The door slammed shut with a sharp, resounding sound that echoed through the tense silence of the store. Everyone's gaze shifted to the entrance, but no one moved. The newcomer hadn't yet revealed themselves fully, just a shadow standing in the doorway, their outline barely visible in the dim light. The young man's heart raced as he tried to make out who it was, his breath catching in his chest. There was something about the way the figure stood tall, but with an air of purpose that felt different from the usual late arrivals. The manager stiffened visibly, his eyes narrowing as the newcomer took a slow step forward. The room felt like it had frozen in place, everyone holding their breath, unsure of what this sudden intrusion meant. For a split second, the young man wondered if the situation could escalate even further. Could this stranger be another attempt to intimidate them? Or was it something else entirely? The figure stepped into the light, and the young man's stomach dropped. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a dark suit with an air of authority about him. But what really caught the young man off guard was the badge the man wore, a badge that made it clear who he was. The manager's face turned white at the sight of it. The newcomer was no ordinary customer. He wasn't just some random bystander. He was an investigator, or more specifically, an internal investigator for the chain that owned the store. His eyes scanned the room briefly before landing on the manager, a look of barely concealed disgust on his face. "Is this what's going on here?" The investigator's voice was low, almost menacing, but it had a sense of calm that cut through the tension in the room. His eyes flickered over to the young man and the older woman, who were still standing near the counter, as though acknowledging their presence before turning his full attention back to the manager. "I've heard reports, but I didn't expect to find something like this today." The manager's face darkened, and for a moment, the young man thought he might collapse. He could see the beads of sweat forming along the manager's forehead, his hands clenched in tight fists at his sides. The power dynamic had shifted so drastically that even the manager seemed unsure how to react. The once overbearing figure now seemed small, trapped under the weight of his own actions. The woman beside the young man didn't flinch. She looked over at the investigator with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Her expression softened as she realized who he was, but there was no joy in her eyes, only a quiet determination, as though this moment was long overdue. "I don't know what you're talking about," the manager stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. "There's nothing going on here. This is just a misunderstanding." The investigator didn't buy it for a second. He stepped closer to the counter, his gaze never leaving the manager. "A misunderstanding? I've been tracking complaints for months, and today, I come in to witness this charade, this disgraceful behavior. I'm afraid this goes way beyond a simple misunderstanding." The tension in the room exploded. The customers, who had been silently observing, exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure how to react. Some looked toward the young man and the woman, perhaps expecting them to speak out, but others seemed too caught in the weight of what was unfolding to say anything. The power balance had shifted dramatically, but no one knew where it would land. The manager sputtered, his voice rising in pitch as his desperation became more evident. "You don't know what you're talking about. You can't just come in here and accuse me of. Accuse?" The investigator's voice dropped dangerously low, his tone now sharp and unmistakably final. "I'm not accusing you. I'm reporting the truth. You've been exploiting your position for far too long. You think you can hide behind your authority, make people feel small and insignificant, and walk away without consequences? Well, guess what? This ends today." A cold, uncomfortable silence filled the store. The weight of the investigator's words hung in the air like a fog that no one could shake off. The manager had no response. His face had gone pale, his eyes darting to the back door, as though looking for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to run now. The young man stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening. This had escalated beyond anything he could have predicted. He had been prepared to fight for his own dignity, but now there was a larger game unfolding. The truth was coming to light, and it was far bigger than his confrontation with the manager. But just as the young man began to feel a flicker of hope, a new wave of anxiety swept over him. What did this mean for him? What did it mean for the store, for the community that had quietly endured this kind of behavior? Would the investigator really expose everything, or was this just another bluff? Could this moment be enough to dismantle the system of power and fear that had held so many people in check? The manager, his face twitching with panic, began to back away slowly, his eyes wild. "I don't deserve this," he muttered, shaking his head as though trying to deny the reality of the situation. "I've worked here for years. This is my life, my career." He turned, glancing frantically around, as if hoping someone would come to his rescue, but no one did. The store, once his kingdom, had turned against him, and the reality of his downfall was closing in. The investigator, however, wasn't moved by the manager's pleas. "Your career is over," he said flatly. "The complaints were just the beginning. Your actions have consequences. And I'm not the only one who's been keeping track of them." There was a sharp intake of breath from the customers as the implication of those words sank in. The young man felt a chill run through him. What did the investigator mean by that? Had there been more complaints? More people who had suffered in silence? What had this manager truly been doing behind the scenes? The investigator reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folder, which he placed on the counter with a quiet thud. He slid it toward the manager, who recoiled slightly, as if the folder itself was an accusation. The young man's eyes narrowed as he caught a glimpse of a few papers poking out of the top documents, perhaps evidence of everything the investigator had uncovered. The manager's face twisted in fear. "What is this?" he hissed, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his voice cracked. "What are you going to do with this?" "You can't." "I'm going to make sure the people who you've heard have a voice," the investigator said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm going to make sure you answer for everything. It's time to end the silence." The young man stood there, watching in stunned silence as the scene unfolded before him. It felt unreal, like something out of a movie, too dramatic to be happening in real life. But it was happening. And in that moment, the stakes couldn't be higher. The manager's world was crumbling before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the investigator stepped back, his eyes never leaving the manager, the young man's thoughts raced. What came next? Would the manager face the consequences of his actions? And more importantly, what would it mean for the young man? Would this moment of courage lead to real change, or would it all fade away in the end? But just as the tension seemed unbearable, the manager's next move sent a shockwave through the room. With a sudden, violent motion, he reached under the counter. The young man's breath itched. Was he going for a weapon? What was happening? The room went silent again, but this time, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its breath as the manager's hand disappeared under the counter. The young man's heart slammed against his chest, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Was he reaching for a weapon? Was this how it would end, with chaos spilling over, all the progress, the courage, the fight for dignity, unraveling in a flash? The manager's eyes flickered from the investigator to the young man, panic still written across his face. His hand stayed beneath the counter for a long, tense moment. Every eye in the room was locked onto him, waiting, unsure what the next move would be. It felt as though the entire store had become a pressure cooker, the seconds ticking by like hours. Then, without warning, the manager jerked his hand back from under the counter and pulled something into view. It wasn't a weapon. It was a bottle of store-brand cleaning spray, the nozzle turned toward the ground. There was a collective exhale from the room. The tension didn't entirely lift, but the immediate fear dissipated. The manager's face, flushed with anger and humiliation, looked even more desperate now. He waved the bottle around in the air, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You think you can just come in here and destroy everything I've worked for?" He spat, his voice trembling. "I've been doing this for years. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it takes to run this place." The investigator remained silent, his eyes cold but observant. The young man and the woman stood their ground, unflinching, as the manager's meltdown continued. Then the unexpected happened. The store door opened again, the bell ringing as a new figure stepped inside. It wasn't another customer, nor another investigator, but someone the young man recognized. A former employee. A familiar face. Someone who had worked here before, someone who had suffered under the manager's rule. The former employee had been one of the first to speak up about the manager's mistreatment, one of the first to tell the story that had started the ripple effect. The young man remembered the days of quiet whispers, hushed conversations in break rooms. Stories of harassment, unfair treatment, and hostility that had been silenced by fear. But here she was now, stepping into the store, her eyes scanning the scene, her expression resolute. "You're out of time," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. The young man's eyes widened as she made her way toward the manager, the words of the investigator still hanging in the air. The manager froze, his expression shifting once again. His eyes darted nervously between the investigator, the young man, and the former employee, as if he realized something was coming to a head. "What do you want from me?" he croaked. "This isn't over. You can't take everything away from me." "You took it from yourself," the former employee replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "You think you can control people with fear and intimidation forever? You've had your chance, and now it's over." She stepped forward, the weight of her words resonating in the space around them. The young man stood in stunned silence as the room seemed to shift again. The power dynamic, the fear, the tension, it was all starting to unravel. Then, with a swift motion, the investigator handed the folder to the former employee. The manager's eyes widened in panic, and his mouth opened as if to protest, but the words caught in his throat. It was too late now. The documents, the evidence of his misdeeds, were finally in the hands of the people who could expose him. "We've collected everything," the investigator said quietly. "This isn't just about one person anymore. It's about everyone he's hurt, everyone he's tried to silence. It ends here." But then, as the young man stood there watching the manager crumble, something unexpected happened, something that none of them could have predicted. The former employee, who had been standing tall just moments ago, suddenly faltered. Her face twisted with confusion, and then, a strange, unsettling shift occurred. She took a step back, her eyes widening with realization. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "I thought I was ready, but I can't." The entire room went silent. The young man's stomach dropped as he watched her, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The former employee had been one of the first to speak out, one of the key figures in all of this. How could she hesitate now? The manager, sensing an opportunity, started to move again. His face twisted into something darker, and he reached for the counter, his hands trembling as he tried to grasp hold of something, anything to regain his control. "See?" he sneered, his voice hoarse. "They can't do it. They don't have the courage to finish what they started. None of you do." The young man's heart raced as he watched the room shift once more. Was the former employee really backing down? Was all this about to fall apart at the last moment? But before anyone could say anything else, the woman who had been standing beside him, the one who had remained quiet and steady throughout the whole ordeal, stepped forward. Her eyes locked onto the manager with unwavering resolve. "It's not about courage," she said quietly. "It's about doing what's right." In an instant, the former employee looked up, her expression changing again. She took a deep breath, and the fear in her eyes slowly faded. With a determined movement, she reached for the folder, pulling it from the investigator's hand. This time, there was no hesitation. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice now steady and firm. "This has to end, and it will." The manager's eyes went wide with shock as the truth of the situation finally hit him. There was no escape, no way out. Everything he had built through manipulation and fear was crashing down around him. The manager took one final, desperate step back, but it was too late. The investigator stepped forward, his hand gently but firmly placed on the manager's shoulder, guiding him toward the inevitable. As the former employee moved to hand the folder over to the authorities, the young man felt a rush of relief flood through him. The manager's downfall wasn't just the result of one person standing up, it was the culmination of countless stories, countless voices, and years of quiet resistance. But even as the sense of justice began to settle over him, he realized something. The fight wasn't truly over. It had only just begun. With the manager led away in handcuffs, the young man looked around the store. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Instead, there was a quiet recognition in the faces around him, a shared understanding that something significant had just happened. But the real work, the real change, was still ahead. And as the door swung open once more, the young man walked out, the weight of the moment still lingering, but a new sense of purpose in his chest. The fight for what was right was far from over, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The young man stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He didn't know what he had expected to feel after everything that had happened: the confrontation, the investigation, the collapse of the manager's grip on the store. But as he walked away, the silence around him felt both heavy and strangely peaceful. There were no celebrations, no cheers from the people inside the store, but there didn't need to be. The moment had already spoken for itself. Justice had been served, but the work wasn't finished. Not yet. He walked slowly, letting the rhythm of his footsteps guide his thoughts. The quiet of the evening gave him room to think. Everything had unfolded so quickly, with twists and turns he couldn't have predicted. Just hours ago, he was standing in the store, unsure whether he could even make a difference. But now, the manager, the person who had been a constant source of fear and oppression, was being led away in handcuffs. It was a satisfying victory, one he couldn't deny. But the feeling didn't last long. As he turned the corner, he spotted the woman who had stood by his side throughout it all. She was walking ahead of him, her pace steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He caught up to her and fell into step beside her, both of them walking without a word for a while. There was no need for words. They both understood what had happened, and the implications of it all. "You okay?" he asked, glancing over at her. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine. Just tired, you know?" The young man agreed. It had been a long day. It had felt like one endless moment of tension, of suspense, of fear that something might fall apart at any given second. But now, with the manager's fate sealed, there was an odd sense of calm in the air. They walked together, silently, for a few more moments. The streetlights flickered overhead as the sun dipped lower behind the buildings. In the distance, the sounds of the city started to pick up again: cars passing by, people talking in the streets. Life was moving on, as it always did, even when significant changes were happening right in front of it. "You know," the young man finally said, breaking the silence, "I thought this would feel bigger somehow." She turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow. "Bigger?" "Yeah. Like more satisfying," he continued, a frown crossing his face. "I guess I expected more of a victory lap. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like the beginning of something. Not the end." She nodded again, her lips curling slightly in what might have been the start of a smile. "That's because it is the beginning," she said. "What happened today, it matters. But it's just one step. There's more work to do." The young man's thoughts flickered back to the store. The manager was gone, but the problems he represented, fear, silence, oppression, wouldn't vanish just because one person was taken down. The truth was, his actions had been only the visible tip of the iceberg. There were others out there, other stores, other businesses, other people who still had to be held accountable. The weight of that reality began to settle in. But instead of feeling discouraged, the young man felt a small, quiet resolve take root inside him. He didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but one thing was clear: there were voices that had been ignored, people who had suffered, and he couldn't turn his back on them. Not now. "I guess we keep going, huh?" he said with a sigh, his voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination. The woman looked at him and smiled for real this time, a genuine warmth in her expression. "That's the only choice we've got." "Hey," he said, stopping in front of her. "What about you? What happens now?" She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "What happens now is up to you," she said, her voice calm but steady. "You've taken your first step. Now it's time to figure out what you want to do with it. What we've done, it's important. But it's just the beginning of a larger story. It's up to you whether you want to be part of that story." The young man stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he felt a real sense of purpose. He had always been someone who reacted to things, someone who took action when pushed. But this was different. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was deciding, for the first time in his life, what kind of world he wanted to help build. "Maybe I don't know yet," he said quietly. "But I know I don't want to walk away from this. I want to keep fighting. For people who don't have a voice. For people who've been silenced for too long." She nodded, her smile growing. "Good," she said simply. "Then you're on the right path." They stood there for a moment longer, and then, with a final nod, she turned and walked away. The young man watched her go, his mind racing with possibilities. There was so much left to do, so much he didn't understand yet, but was ready to learn. This wasn't just about the store, or the manager, or even the people who had witnessed it all. This was about something much larger: the fight for fairness, for justice, and for a world where no one had to feel afraid of speaking up. He turned and began walking in the other direction, his mind filled with thoughts of what was next. The fight had just begun, but he knew now that he was ready. He would find the way forward, step by step, no matter how long it took. And somehow, he knew that along the way, he would meet others who felt the same, others who were willing to stand up, who were tired of being silent, and who wanted to change the world, just like he did. As he walked through the streets, the light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the sounds of the city wrapped around him. The world felt different now. He had a role to play in it, a purpose that stretched beyond the small, isolated struggles. The young man wasn't just walking away from the store, he was walking towards something much bigger. And as the night began to settle in, the future, uncertain and full of challenges, seemed just a little bit brighter.